So, we talked about the biology of it, we talked about human being versus person, we talked about human rights. And a lot of times this is where pro-lifers stop. If you agree that the fetus is a human being and it has moral worth and human beings should have human rights, then you should be pro-life, right? What's the problem? It's actually not as simple as that. And I'm going to talk about one more premise that I think we do not talk about enough that's very important. And that is bodily rights. Okay? Probably most of you have heard at least some of the more, I think, the more nuanced, more thoughtful pro-choicers. They're not going to argue about the biology of it because that's ridiculous. And they might argue about personhood a little bit, but the stronger pro-choice argument is to say, you know what? The fetus is a human being in the moral sense, like a person, for the sake of argument. But it doesn't matter because no one is allowed to use your body against your will, the fetus or an adult or anybody. So the fourth premise in the secular pro-life position is to specifically talk about how bodily integrity, bodily rights, is not enough to justify most abortions. And I'm going to spend a bit of time on this too because we don't talk about it very much. So how many of you have seen things like this? I mean, this comes up all the time, right? And I feel like, not always, but a lot of times, pro-lifers kind of skirt around this. Pro-lifers focus on fetal life, and pro-choicers focus on the woman, in general. There's exceptions. And we talk right past each other, right? They don't want to acknowledge that the fetus is even a human organism, and we don't talk enough about how pregnancy, the very real effects it has for women, okay? Both the gestation and childbirth and all of the socioeconomic effects after that, it's considerable. And I think it would be useful for all pro-lifers to spend a good deal of time ruminating on that. Obviously, I don't think that the effects are enough to justify abortion, but it's not right to just act like they're not there, or to undermine how big of a deal pregnancy is. Okay? And beyond that, that's the social stuff, but to undermine how big of a deal it is to have something as intimate as your body being used by an entity that, on a mental, emotional level, you may not have wanted. That's a big deal, okay? And it's not right to say things like, oh, it's 9 months, whatever. It's a big deal. And what these guys are saying is, like I said, nobody can use your body against your will. I want to be clear, too. A lot of times when we talk about this, pro-lifers will say, well, you can't do anything you want with your body. Your right to swing your fist ends where my nose begins. That's true. That is irrelevant. That's not what most pro-choicers are saying. They're not saying you can literally do anything you want with your body, because that would be ridiculous. We clearly can't do that. Every law we have, pretty much, will stop us from doing that, okay? What they're saying is other people can't use your body against your will, okay? That's a different argument, that's a stronger argument, and that's what you need to address. So I'm going to talk about, as an example, this is a real court case called Shimp versus McFall. McFall had a fatal bone marrow disease, and if you don't know, bone marrow matches can be really hard to find. And he found out that his cousin, Shimp, was a match, and he wanted Shimp to donate to save his life. This is not a hypothetical for the abortion debate, this happened. And Shimp didn't want to, I don't know why, whatever reason. And so McFall sued him and said, he should have to donate to me because I am going to die without this, and he's the only match that I know of. And the court sided with Shimp. They did say that him refusing to donate was morally indefensible. They thought it was terrible. But they still said he didn't have to, and this is why. They said, for a society which respects the rights of one individual to sink its teeth into the jugular vein or neck of one of its members and suck from its sustenance for another member is revolting to our hard-wrought concepts of jurisprudence. Forcible extraction of living body tissue causes revulsion to the judicial mind. So this wasn't about abortion, but you can see the parallels, right? And then the much more famous example, probably many of you have heard of this, but in case you haven't, is Judith Jarvis Thompson's article in defense of abortion, came out in 1971 with The Violinist. How many of you have heard of The Violinist? Nice, good, like at least half of you, that's good. For those of you who haven't, this is the deal. She says you wake up in the hospital, you don't know why you're there, and you look around and your kidneys are attached to some guy in the bed next to you. He's unconscious and you don't know what's going on. It's clear that they're doing some weird science fiction dialysis thing, and the administrator of the hospital comes running in and he says, oh my gosh, you're awake, I'm so sorry. That guy is this really famous violinist. He's really good at what he does and he has a lot of fans, and it turns out he has this fatal kidney disease. And he's got these fans called the Society of Music Lovers, and somehow, don't worry about it, they figured out that you are the only match for this guy. So they kidnapped you, and somehow, don't worry about it, they hooked you up to this violinist. And if you unplug, he will die. But the good news is, if you stay plugged in for 9 months, he'll be okay, and you can both go on your way. And so then Thompson says, of course, should you be morally obligated to stay attached to him, and more importantly, should you be legally obligated to stay attached to him? I mean, I think we can all agree that if you stay attached, that's really nice. That's good that you're not letting that guy die, even though this has nothing to do with you, and it's a huge inconvenience. Inconvenience doesn't really cover it, it'd be terrible. But should you be legally obligated to? That's the question. And there are many people who I wouldn't call pro-life or pro-choice who aren't really in the abortion debate, and they hear this and they're like, yeah, no, you shouldn't. You know what? I get it. And you notice that this argument does not rest on the fetus not being a person. The violinist is a person. You're not saying they're not a person. You're not saying they're not a full human being. You're saying it doesn't matter. They shouldn't be allowed to use your body against your will. And then another thing that comes up a lot too, not as much as this, but sometimes this car crash analogy, where you drive. You know there's a risk that you could crash into somebody. And maybe you drive like super cautiously, like annoyingly cautiously. There's still some risk that you could crash into somebody. And if you do, and they're dying, and they need like a blood donation, it would be really nice if you donated blood, if you happen to match them or whatever, but should you be legally obligated to, is the question. So you see why this is a big concern for people, because there are a lot of examples in our society where bodily rights is more important to people than another person dying, right? But I'm going to explain to you why we don't think it's enough, at least not in most cases. And I'm going to talk about 4 objections. There's actually a lot more than that, but for brevity's sake. The first one, the most obvious one, is the responsibility objection. So the court said that it was morally indefensible that he didn't donate to McFall. What would they think if he was the one who gave McFall the disease? Like, if he took some action, he knew there was some risk that McFall would get a bone marrow disease, and then when McFall got it, he was like, that sucks, but I don't have to give you anything because it's my body. That changes the tone of the situation. Same thing with the violinist. A huge problem with Thompson's violinist argument is that it assumes you had nothing to do with the situation. In reality, 99% of pregnancies are the result of consensual sex. 99% of abortions on pregnancies are the result of consensual sex. Which means that you took some action that I would hope pretty much every single person knows there's some risk of pregnancy. Even if you use birth control, there's always some risk. So it'd be like with the violinist, if you were taking some action that was, I don't know, good for your relationship, or that you just really enjoyed, and you knew there was some risk that it would give him a fatal kidney disease, but you did it anyway, and then he got it, and you were like, that sucks, but that's not my problem. I mean, it changes the whole tone of the situation. You're not just some innocent person that got thrown in there. You gave him the disease. His life is at risk because of something you did, not something he did, and not something some third party did. So that changes a lot. It doesn't change the car crash one. Car crash, you knew that there was a risk, right? So it doesn't change all of them, but it's a big one. Another major difference is the unique bodily connection of pregnancy. At least for now, until we get major science advances, a woman who is pregnant is the only person who can sustain that life. So in the car crash analogy, we have entire infrastructures of organ donations and blood banks and hospitals and things for that purpose. If you were driving a car in some weird alternate reality where you knew that if you crashed you would, for whatever reason, be literally the only person that could save them, you probably would still drive from time to time, but I bet you'd be way more careful about it. Right? That's the other part. Another thing I think is worth noting is the frequency of these problems. Some people say it doesn't matter, but when you have sex, even if you use birth control, there's a risk of pregnancy, and the risk, so according to Planned Parenthood statistics on birth control, if you use a condom, is a 2 to 18% chance of pregnancy, depending on if you know what you're doing, and even if you use the pill, it's a 1 to 9% chance, and even if you get a tubal ligation, female sterilization, those have a 0.3% failure rate in the sense that you get pregnant. So if you do the math on that, that means that if you drive every day, one day every year, you will have a fatal car crash in which they can only be saved by your body. Like, it's hard to imagine a situation that crazy, but if it was like that, I don't think we would be indifferent to it. I think that that would make a big difference in terms of driving, and in terms of the risks entailed. And then, donating versus rescinding donation. There's also the difference there. So, with Shimp and McFall? What would it be like if he had his bone marrow removed and it was ready to go to give to McFall, and then he was like, actually don't give it to him? It would sound very different. Or the violinist does a better job of that, where you're already donating a Rossini donation. But imagine you get in a car wreck and you're drawing blood and they're getting ready to put the blood into them, and then you're like, actually don't give it to them. It's a little bit different. Pregnancy, they're already depending on you, and you're not refusing to donate, you're removing donation. Some people think it doesn't matter, some people think it does. And there's other objections too, like killing versus letting die, right? If the violinist, you unplugged, you're letting him die. What if you went up and chopped him up because you didn't want to be attached to him? Because that's more akin to abortion. There's other objections. There's a bunch of different objections to these things, but the point is that you have all these analogies that are supposed to explain bodily rights, but at least all the ones I've heard fail in major relevant ways. And analogies aren't meant to be identical, but they are meant to be appropriate in the relevant ways, and maybe that's the point. Pregnancy is actually very unique. It happens all the time, but it's a very unique kind of connection, and it's very difficult to describe situations that recreate the physical circumstances and the moral implications. And even the Supreme Court in Roe v. Wade knew that. So when people talk about bodily rights, Roe v. Wade was not decided on bodily rights. It was decided on a right to privacy, and it specifically rejected the bodily rights argument. They say appellant and some amici argue that the woman's right is absolute, and that she is entitled to terminate her pregnancy at whatever time, in whatever way, and for whatever reason she alone chooses. With this, we do not agree. In fact, it is not clear to us that the claim asserted by some amici that one has an unlimited right to do with one's body as one pleases bears a relationship to the right to privacy previously articulated. The courts refused to recognize an unlimited right like this in the past. Now, that might be different if it came up with the Supreme Court now, and there's plenty of arguments for that one way or the other, but the point is that Roe v. Wade was not decided on bodily rights. They specifically rejected bodily rights as a sufficient argument for the right to abortion. So all I'm asking is that when you are making an argument about abortion, make sure that you are prepared and ready to talk about bodily rights. It's a very strong objection. It's reasonable for people on the fence to be concerned about this, and we need to be able to talk about it without just saying, well, you can't do whatever you want with your body. It's more than that, okay? So those are the four purposes of the secular position. And we would love it if you participated with us, even if it just means following us on Facebook, just to be familiar with what's going on in sort of our corner of the pro-life movement. We love having more people around share ideas and give us feedback too on how we're coming off to the rest of the pro-life movement so that we can continue to communicate effectively. So that's it for me, and I can stay as long as you want for questions.